They called him a traitor the moment he chose not to pull the trigger, and by the time the wind buried his footprints, no one remembered his name except the people he was never meant to save. Before we continue, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your city or state in the comments, and if you believe justice doesn't always ride with a badge, stay with me. The sun hung low over the red desert, stretching shadows thin across miles of cracked earth, and Ethan Calloway stood alone with dust settling on his boots, his hand hovering just inches above the revolver at his side. 50 yards ahead, a figure moved slowly, barely upright, wrapped in torn fabric the color of dry clay, her steps uneven like the land itself had turned against her. He had been tracking signs all morning, hoof prints, broken brush, whispers of movement carried by the wind, but this was not what command had described. There was no war party here. No threat. Just one woman, breathing hard, trying not to fall. He could hear the echo of orders in his mind, clear and cold as steel. Any Apache movement beyond the ridge was to be stopped, no exceptions. And yet, as the distance closed between them, something shifted. The woman, no, the girl, though there was nothing fragile in the way she held herself, stopped and turned. Her eyes met his across the open space, dark and steady, not pleading, not afraid, just waiting. As if she had already decided what he would do, and had accepted it. Ethan felt the weight of that silence more than any shouted command. The desert carried no sound now. No wind. No birds. Just the quiet space between two lives that were never meant to cross. He noticed the small details without meaning to, the dust clinging to her hair, the faint glint of something around her neck, a stone catching sunlight like a fragment of the sky. She didn't reach for a weapon. Didn't run. She just stood there, breathing, watching. "You shouldn't be here," he said finally, his voice low, rough from disuse. It sounded strange in the open air, like it didn't belong to him anymore. She didn't answer right away. When she did, her English was careful, each word placed with intent. "Neither should you." The words didn't challenge him. They didn't accuse. They just existed, like a truth that had no need to argue. Ethan exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening, then loosening again at his side. Somewhere behind him, miles back along the trail, were men who would not hesitate, men who would see this moment as simple, clean, necessary. But nothing about this felt simple. The girl took a step forward, and for a moment, his instincts flared, trained, drilled, unquestioning, but he didn't move. Instead, he watched. She moved carefully, like every step cost her something. Not fear. Something deeper. Then he saw it, the faint stain along her side, the way her breath caught just slightly with each movement. She was hurt. Not dying. Not yet. But close enough that time had begun to matter. "Why are you still standing?" he asked, more to himself than to her. She tilted her head, studying him the same way he studied her, as if trying to place him somewhere in a world that didn't quite fit anymore. "Because I am not done walking," she said. Simple. Final. He looked past her then, scanning the horizon out of habit, and that's when he saw it, the thin line of dust far off in the distance, rising just enough to betray movement. Riders. More than one. Closing in. The kind of line that didn't wander. The kind that followed. His jaw tightened. Time, which had felt suspended only moments ago, snapped back into place. He knew what that meant. Knew what would happen if they found her here, alone, with him standing just a few feet away doing nothing. The story would already be written before anyone asked a single question. He glanced back at her, and for the first time, something like urgency flickered in her expression, not fear, but recognition. She saw it too. The approaching line. The closing distance. The narrowing of choices. Ethan's hand finally moved, but not toward his weapon. Instead, he reached for the canteen at his side, pulling it free and holding it out, not stepping closer, just offering it across the space between them. The gesture hung there, uncertain, fragile as glass. She looked at it, then at him, and for a long second, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, she stepped forward and took it. Her fingers brushed his, just for an instant, and something shifted again, quiet, unspoken, irreversible. The wind returned, carrying the distant rhythm of hooves, steady and closing. Ethan didn't look back this time. He didn't need to. He already knew what was coming. And in that moment, with the desert watching and the past tightening behind him, he made the kind of decision that doesn't echo right away, but never stops echoing once it begins. The canteen felt heavier in her hands than it should have, as if the water inside carried more than just relief, and she did not drink right away, not because she did not need it but because she understood what it meant to accept it. Ethan watched her without turning his head, his eyes fixed on the horizon where that thin line of dust had begun to rise higher, thicker now, no longer a distant suggestion but a certainty moving closer with every passing second. The rhythm of hooves was still faint, but it was there, steady, deliberate, the kind of sound that did not lose its trail. She finally lifted the canteen, her movements controlled, careful, and took a small sip, just enough to steady herself, then lowered it again. She did not thank him. She did not need to. Out here, gestures spoke louder than words ever could. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, boots grinding against the dry earth, and for a moment, he considered the path behind him, the long stretch of land that led back to men who wore the same uniform he did, men who would ask questions he could not answer without betraying something he had not even fully understood yet. He reached up slowly and removed his hat, brushing dust from the brim before settling it back down, a small habit that gave him time to think. The girl watched him with that same steady gaze, her fingers now wrapped around the canteen as if it were something fragile, something borrowed rather than given. "They will not stop," she said quietly, her voice carrying just enough to reach him without forcing him to turn. Ethan nodded once, almost to himself. "No," he replied. "They will not." The words hung between them, not heavy, not dramatic, just true. He took a step to the side then, angling his body so he could see both her and the approaching dust line without fully facing either, a man caught between two directions that no longer led to the same place. "How far can you go?" he asked. She hesitated, not out of uncertainty but out of honesty, as if weighing the answer against what it would cost to say it aloud. "Far enough if I do not fall," she said. Ethan almost smiled at that, not because it was hopeful, but because it was real. He reached down to his saddlebag and pulled out a small piece of cloth, worn and faded, then stepped forward just enough to place it on a flat stone between them, not crossing the invisible line that still existed, but narrowing it. "Wrap your side," he said. "It will slow the bleeding." She looked at the cloth, then at him, and for a brief moment something softer passed through her expression, not trust exactly, but the beginning of it. She knelt carefully, movements deliberate, and began to press the cloth against her side, her breathing steady despite the effort. Ethan turned his head slightly then, just enough to watch the horizon again, and the dust was closer now, the shapes within it beginning to form, riders spreading just enough to cover ground, to close gaps, to make sure nothing slipped through. He could count at least 4 now, maybe 5, though the light made it difficult to be certain. He knew their patterns. He knew how they moved. He knew how this would end if nothing changed. "You have a name?" he asked after a moment, the question coming out quieter than he expected. She finished tying the cloth, then rose slowly, meeting his gaze again. "Ayana," she said. The name settled into the air between them, carrying weight without explanation. Ethan nodded once. "Ethan," he replied. "No rank. No title. Just a name, stripped down to something simpler." The wind picked up again, stronger this time, pulling at his coat, lifting strands of her hair, carrying the scent of dust and heat and something else beneath it, something that felt like the edge of a decision not yet made. Ayana took a step closer, just one, and reached into the fold of her garment, drawing out the small object he had noticed earlier. Up close, it was clearer now, a piece of turquoise stone wrapped in thin silver, worn smooth by time, catching the light in a way that felt almost out of place in the harshness around them. She held it out, not forcing it into his hand, just offering it the same way he had offered the canteen. "For the water," she said. Ethan looked at it, then at her, and shook his head slightly. "Keep it," he said. "You might need it more than I do." She did not pull it back. Instead, she stepped forward again, closing the space between them entirely this time, and placed it into his hand before he could refuse a second time. Her fingers lingered just long enough to make sure he would not drop it, then withdrew. "You will need it," she said, her voice steady, certain in a way that made him pause. The sound of hooves was clearer now, no longer distant, no longer something that could be ignored. Ethan curled his fingers around the stone, feeling its weight, its warmth from her touch, and for the first time since he had stepped into this desert that morning, he understood that whatever happened next was not going to be something he could step away from. He looked at Ayanna, really looked this time, not as a target, not as a stranger, but as someone whose path had crossed his for a reason he did not yet have words for. Then he turned his body fully toward the rising dust, placing himself between it and her without thinking, the movement as natural as breathing, and the line that had once separated them was gone. The wind shifted again, carrying the sound of approaching riders with a clarity that left no room for doubt, and Ethan stood still as the distance between what was behind him and what stood beside him narrowed into a single line he could no longer step away from. He adjusted his stance slightly, boots settling into the dust, his shoulders squared but not tense, the kind of posture that did not invite conflict yet did not yield to it either. Ayanna remained just behind him, close enough that he could feel her presence without turning, her breathing steady now, controlled, as if she had already accepted whatever came next and chosen to stand through it rather than run from it. The riders broke through the low haze of dust at last, their shapes sharpening against the bright sky, horses slowing as they approached, not out of hesitation but out of recognition. They saw him. They saw where he stood. And more importantly, they saw who he stood in front of. The lead rider brought his horse to a measured stop about 20 yards out, the others fanning slightly behind him, creating a quiet line that stretched across the open ground. No one reached for a weapon. No one raised a voice. But the tension settled into the space like heat rising off stone, invisible yet undeniable. Ethan did not move forward. He did not step back. He simply stood, the small turquoise stone still held in his hand, its smooth surface pressing into his palm like a reminder of something he had not yet fully named. "Calloway," the lead rider said, his voice carrying easily across the distance, calm but edged with something harder beneath it. Ethan recognized it immediately. Authority mixed with expectation. The kind of voice that assumed the answer before the question was even asked. Ethan lifted his chin slightly, acknowledging the call without answering it directly. The rider's gaze shifted then, just for a moment, past Ethan's shoulder, catching the outline of Ayanna standing there, her posture upright despite the strain it must have taken to remain so still. The silence stretched, long enough to feel intentional. "You lost the trail," the rider continued, though the question was already unraveling as he spoke it. Ethan shook his head once, slow and deliberate. "No," he said. "Nothing more." The word landed between them, simple, incomplete, and somehow heavier because of it. The rider studied him, eyes narrowing just enough to show the shift in thought, the moment when assumption gives way to uncertainty. "Then step aside," he said, not raising his voice, not needing to. It was not a command shouted across a battlefield. It was something quieter. More certain. Ethan felt the weight of it settle into his chest, not as pressure, but as a choice being placed in front of him, clear and unavoidable. He could step aside. He could let the moment pass through him. And return to a life that had already been decided for him long before this day began. Or he could remain where he was, and accept whatever followed. He glanced down briefly at the stone in his hand, its color bright against the dust that covered everything else, and for a moment he thought of how easily something small could be overlooked, how something simple could carry meaning far beyond its size if someone chose to see it that way. Then he closed his fingers around it and looked back up. "She is not what you think," he said. The words came out steady, not defensive, not pleading, just certain. The rider's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes shifted, a tightening, a recalculation. "That is not your call," he replied. Ethan nodded slightly, as if agreeing with a truth that no longer held the same weight it once did. "It is now," he said. The wind moved between them again, stronger this time, tugging at coats and stirring dust in small spirals that caught the light before settling back to the ground. Behind him, Ayanna did not speak. She did not step forward. She simply remained where she was, allowing him to stand in that space without interruption, without question. The riders held their line, their horses shifting beneath them, restless not from fear but from the stillness that had settled over everything. Moments passed, each one stretching longer than the last, until time itself seemed to slow under the weight of what had not yet happened. The lead rider exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible but enough to break the rhythm that had held them all in place. "You are making this harder than it needs to be," he said. Ethan's gaze did not waver. "No," he answered quietly. "I am making it what it is." The words did not challenge. They did not accuse. They simply stood, the same way he did, grounded in something that did not need to be explained to exist. The rider looked at him for a long moment, then glanced once more toward Ayanna, as if searching for something there that might justify the outcome he had already decided. But she did not move. She did not lower her gaze. She met it, steady and unbroken, and in that exchange something subtle shifted again, something that could not be named but could be felt all the same. The line between them held. And for the first time since the riders had appeared on the horizon, it was no longer clear which side of it Ethan truly stood on. The silence did not break all at once, it shifted, like heat bending the air above the desert floor, and Ethan felt it in the way the horses settled, in the way the lead rider's hand rested just a little too still against the saddle horn, in the way no one spoke for longer than men trained to act ever should. Dust curled low around their boots, thin spirals rising and falling as if the ground itself was deciding whether to hold or release what stood upon it. Ethan did not look back, but he knew Ayanna was still there, still standing, still choosing not to run even though every path behind her had already closed. He had seen that kind of stillness before, but never like this, never without anger, never without fear trying to break through it. This was different. This was something quieter. The lead rider shifted in his saddle at last, the leather creaking faintly, the smallest sound carrying farther than it should have in the open air. "You do not understand what you are standing in front of," he said, not harshly, not yet, but with the kind of certainty that came from a lifetime of never needing to question it. Ethan let out a slow breath, the kind that settles deep before words come. "I understand enough," he answered. The rider's gaze sharpened, just a fraction. "Then you understand that this is not about one person," he continued. "This is about keeping order. About preventing what comes next if we let this pass." Ethan tilted his head slightly, as if considering the words rather than resisting them. "And what comes next?" he asked. The question landed differently than the others. It did not challenge. It did not accuse. It simply asked for something real. The rider hesitated, just for a second, and in that second the certainty cracked enough for something else to show through. Not doubt. Not quite. But something close to it. "You know what comes next," he said finally. Ethan nodded once. "Yes," he replied quietly. "I do." He paused, then added, "That is why I am still here." The wind pressed harder now, lifting grains of sand that brushed against skin and fabric, a constant reminder that nothing in this place stayed still for long, no matter how much men tried to force it to. Behind him, Ayanna shifted her weight, just enough for him to hear it, and he realized then that she was closer than before, not by much, but enough that if he stepped back even once, the space between them would disappear entirely. The riders noticed it too. Ethan saw it in the way their line tightened, not advancing, not retreating, just preparing. "You are making a mistake," the lead rider said, his voice lower now, not carried for the group but meant for Ethan alone. There is still time to step away from it. Ethan looked at him for a long moment, then glanced down at his own hand, still closed around the turquoise stone. He opened his fingers slightly, just enough to see the color against his palm, bright and steady, untouched by the dust that covered everything else. "I think I already did," he said. The rider followed his gaze briefly, catching sight of the stone, and something in his expression shifted again, this time sharper, more focused, as if a piece of the story had just fallen into place. "She gave you that," he said. It was not a question. Ethan nodded. "Yes." The rider exhaled slowly, his shoulders settling as if the weight of decision had finally found a place to rest. "Then you have chosen," he said. Ethan closed his hand again, the stone disappearing from view, and lifted his eyes back to meet the man's gaze. "Yes," he answered. No more words followed. None were needed. The desert seemed to hold its breath, the space between men narrowing not in distance but in meaning, in the quiet understanding that whatever happened next would not be undone. Ayanna stepped forward then, just enough that she stood at Ethan's shoulder, not behind him, not hidden, but beside him, her presence no longer something he carried alone. She did not speak. She did not need to. The riders saw her now, clearly, fully, and in that moment the shape of the situation changed again, not in force, not in numbers, but in something harder to measure. The lead rider studied them both, his eyes moving from Ethan to Ayanna and back again, as if searching for a way to separate what had already been joined. He did not find it. The wind passed through once more, stronger than before, pulling at coats and hair and the edges of everything that had been carefully held in place, and when it settled, something in the air had changed. Not broken. Not resolved. Just, shifted. Ethan adjusted his stance again, not stepping forward, not stepping back, simply grounding himself where he stood, and for the first time since the riders had appeared, he understood that this was no longer about stopping something from happening. It was about standing in front of it and deciding what it would mean when it did. The space between them did not collapse, it deepened, like a canyon carved not by force but by time, and Ethan felt it settle into his bones with a quiet certainty that no order could undo. The riders did not advance, but they did not leave either, their presence stretching across the desert like a line drawn in dust that refused to fade. The lead rider lowered his gaze for a brief moment, not in defeat, not in surrender, but in recognition of something that had shifted beyond command. When he looked up again, his expression had changed, not softer, not kinder, just, aware. "You are standing outside the line now," he said, his voice quieter than before, carrying less authority and more weight. Ethan did not respond right away. He watched the man carefully, noting the small details, the way his shoulders had eased just slightly, the way his grip on the reins was no longer rigid but measured. These were not signs of weakness. They were signs of understanding. "Maybe the line was never where we thought it was," Ethan said finally. The words did not land like a challenge. They settled, steady and unavoidable. The wind moved again, brushing past them all, lifting the edges of coats, carrying the faint scent of dry earth and something older beneath it, something that did not belong to any one man or any one side. Ayanna stood beside him without shifting, her presence no longer something that needed to be protected but something that existed on its own terms. The riders saw it now, not just her, but what she represented in that moment, and the silence that followed was no longer tense. It was reflective. The lead rider turned his head slightly, glancing at the men behind him, and though no words were exchanged, something passed between them, something understood without needing to be spoken. When he faced forward again, the decision had already been made. "We will turn back," he said. Not loudly. Not with force. Just clearly. One of the riders behind him shifted in his saddle, a subtle movement that might have been resistance, might have been surprise, but it did not break the line. The leader did not look back again. He did not need to. "This does not change what comes after," he added, his eyes returning to Ethan. Ethan nodded once. "No," he said. "It does not. But there was something in his voice now, something steady that had not been there before. The rider studied him for a moment longer, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if acknowledging a truth that had taken longer than it should have to see. He turned his horse slowly, the movement deliberate, unhurried, and one by one the others followed, their line breaking not in chaos but in quiet order, dissolving back into the desert the same way it had formed. The sound of hooves faded gradually, not disappearing all at once but stretching thinner with distance until it became part of the wind again. Ethan did not move until the last trace of dust settled back to the ground. Only then did he exhale fully, a breath he had not realized he had been holding. Beside him, Ayanna shifted slightly, her balance returning, her stance steady despite everything that had just passed. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to say that would add to what had already been understood. Ethan opened his hand slowly, looking down at the turquoise stone resting against his palm, its color still bright, still unchanged by everything that had happened around it. He closed his fingers again, not tightly, just enough to hold it there, as if it belonged. When he finally turned to look at her, the desert felt different. Not safer. Not easier. Just, clearer. And somewhere in that quiet clarity, a path had begun that neither of them could turn away from now. The desert did not rush to fill the space the riders had left behind, it held the silence like something sacred, stretching it thin across the horizon until even the wind seemed to move more carefully, as if aware that something unseen had just taken place. Ethan remained where he was for a moment longer, his boots still pressed into the same marks they had carved into the dust, his hand resting loosely at his side with the turquoise stone still warm against his palm. He had stood his ground, and the world had not broken apart the way he had been taught it would. That alone felt strange enough to make him pause. Ayanna shifted beside him, not with urgency, not with relief, but with the quiet acknowledgement that the moment had passed and something else had begun in its place. She stepped forward slowly, her movement steady despite the strain that still lingered beneath them, and glanced once toward the horizon where the riders had disappeared. "They will remember this," she said. Her voice was calm, not warning, not afraid, just certain. Ethan nodded slightly, his gaze following hers. "So will I," he replied. The words felt heavier than they sounded, like something that would stay long after the dust had settled. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Ethan turned back toward his horse, the animal standing a few yards away, reins loose, patient in the way only creatures used to long waits could be. He walked toward it slowly, each step deliberate, as if giving himself time to think through something that no longer needed thinking. He reached the saddle and rested his hand against it, feeling the worn leather under his fingers, the familiar texture grounding him in a way the past few minutes had not. "You cannot stay here," he said without turning. Ayanna did not answer immediately. He could hear her steps behind him, light but measured, closing the distance between them. "I was not planning to," she said. He nodded once, then reached into his saddlebag and pulled out another canteen. Fuller than the first, along with a small bundle of dried provisions wrapped in cloth. He set them carefully on the saddle before stepping aside, giving her space without making it obvious. "Take these," he said. "There is a ridge about 2 miles north. Follow it until the ground dips. There is water there, not much, but enough." She studied the items for a moment, then looked at him, her expression unreadable but not distant. "You are not coming," she said. It was not a question. Ethan shook his head slightly. "If I do, they will not stop next time," he answered. The truth of it settled between them without resistance. Ayanna reached for the bundle, her fingers moving over the cloth as if committing its weight to memory, then took the canteen as well. She did not thank him. She did not need to. Instead, she stepped closer, just enough that he could see the faint lines of exhaustion beneath her composure, the cost of everything she had carried before this moment. "Then you will stand here alone," she said quietly. Ethan let out a small breath, something close to a dry laugh but without humor. "I have been alone before," he said. Ayanna's gaze did not shift. "Not like this," she replied. The words lingered, not sharp, not accusing, just, true. Ethan did not answer. He did not need to. He adjusted the strap on his saddle, tightening it slightly more than necessary, a small action that gave his hands something to do while the weight of what lay ahead settled into place. Ayanna turned then, not abruptly, not with hesitation, but with purpose. She began to walk, her steps measured, each one carrying her farther from the place where their paths had crossed and toward something that waited beyond it. After a few paces, she stopped and looked back once. Ethan had not moved. He stood beside his horse, the desert stretching behind him, the horizon open and unbroken. Their eyes met again, just for a moment, and in that moment everything that had been said and everything that had not found its place without needing words. Then she turned away and continued on. Ethan watched until her figure grew smaller against the vastness, until the color of her clothing blended into the land itself, until the line between her and the horizon disappeared completely. Only then did he look down at the stone in his hand once more, its surface catching the light in a way that felt almost out of place in the emptiness around him. He closed his fingers around it again, slower this time, as if sealing something that could not be undone, and lifted his gaze back toward the direction the riders had gone. The wind picked up once more, carrying dust across the ground, and somewhere within it, a different kind of silence began to form, one that did not wait for what might come next, but accepted it. The sun had begun its slow descent, stretching the shadows longer across the desert floor, and Ethan Calloway finally moved, not because he wanted to, but because standing still any longer would have meant pretending that nothing had changed. He placed his foot in the stirrup and pulled himself onto the saddle with a practiced motion, the leather creaking beneath his weight, the familiar rhythm grounding him in a world that no longer felt as certain as it had that morning. The horse shifted beneath him, sensing something different in its rider, something quieter, less directed, and Ethan let the reins rest loosely in his hand instead of tightening them as he normally would. He did not turn north. He did not follow the ridge he had described. Instead, he guided the horse slowly toward the path the riders had taken, not to catch them, not to join them, but to meet what waited beyond that line he had crossed. The land stretched open ahead, miles of dry earth broken only by scattered brush and distant rock formations that caught the fading light like old bones under the sky. Every step forward felt measured, not rushed, not hesitant, just deliberate, as if each one carried weight he could not set down. The wind followed him, low and steady, brushing against his coat and carrying with it the faint memory of voices, of orders, of a life that had been simple because it had never been questioned. He reached into his pocket and drew out the turquoise stone again, turning it between his fingers as the light shifted across its surface. It was small. Unremarkable to anyone who did not know what it meant. And yet it had changed the direction of everything. Ethan exhaled slowly, then tucked it back into his pocket, deeper this time, as if placing it closer to something that needed protecting. The horizon darkened slightly as the sun dipped lower, and a faint outline of a structure began to take shape in the distance, the edge of the outpost where he had started his day, where men would be waiting, where questions would be asked even if no one wanted the answers. He slowed the horse as he approached, not out of fear, but because there was no reason to hurry toward something that would not move without him. Figures stood near the entrance, silhouettes against the dimming light, their posture alert, their attention already fixed on his approach. They had been watching for him. He could see it in the way they shifted, in the way one of them stepped forward before he had even come within speaking distance. Ethan brought the horse to a stop about 15 feet from the entrance and remained seated for a moment, looking at the place as if seeing it for the first time. The wooden posts, the worn gate, the dust that never settled no matter how many times it was swept. It all looked the same. But it did not feel the same. "You took your time," one of the men called out, his voice carrying the edge of something held back, not quite accusation, not quite relief. Ethan swung his leg over and stepped down from the saddle, his boots hitting the ground with a soft thud that seemed louder than it should have. He did not answer right away. He did not need to. The man stepped closer, studying him, his gaze moving from Ethan's face to his hands, then back again, searching for something that was no longer there. "Did you find her?" he asked finally. The question hung in the air, heavier than the dust that surrounded them. Ethan met his eyes, steady, unflinching. "Yes," he said. The word was simple, but it did not carry the meaning the man expected. A pause followed, brief but sharp enough to cut through the quiet. "And?" the man pressed. Ethan reached up slowly and removed his hat, holding it at his side as he looked past the man, toward the open land beyond the outpost, toward the direction where Ayanna had disappeared into the horizon. The wind moved again, softer now, almost like a breath passing through the space between what had been and what was coming. "And she kept walking," he said. The man frowned slightly, confusion tightening his expression. "That is not what I asked," he replied. Ethan nodded once, as if acknowledging the difference, but not correcting it. "It is the answer," he said. The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with everything that had not been said, everything that could not be undone, and everything that would come next whether anyone was ready for it or not. Ethan placed his hat back on his head, the brim casting a shadow across his eyes, and stepped forward, crossing into the outpost not as a man returning, but as one who had left something behind that he could never pick back up again. The outpost did not welcome him back, it absorbed him, the same way dry ground takes in a drop of water without changing its shape, and Ethan felt that the moment his boots crossed the worn threshold between open land and ordered space. The air inside carried a different weight, thicker, shaped by routine and expectation, by voices that spoke in commands rather than questions. Men moved around him, some glancing up, some pretending not to, but all of them aware that something had shifted even if they could not yet name it. Ethan walked past them without slowing, his step steady, his posture unchanged, but there was a quiet distance in the way he carried himself now, as if part of him had remained out there in the open and refused to follow him back. The man who had first spoken to him fell into step at his side, not close enough to crowd him, but close enough to make it clear that this conversation was not finished. "You left her out there," he said, his voice lower now, less certain than before. Ethan kept his eyes forward, watching the far wall of the outpost where the last light of the day stretched across the wood in long, fading lines. "No," he replied. "She left." The distinction was small, but it carried something the other man did not immediately understand. They reached the center of the yard, where a few others had gathered without meaning to, drawn by the quiet tension that followed Ethan like a shadow. No one spoke. They waited. Ethan stopped at last, turning slowly to face them, his expression calm, unreadable, but not closed. Just, distant. The man beside him crossed his arms, searching his face for something that would make sense of what he had heard. "You are telling me you let her go," he said. Not accusing. Not yet. Just trying to place the pieces in a way that still followed the rules he knew. Ethan considered the words, then shook his head slightly. "No," he said again. I stood still. She chose her direction. The wind slipped through the open gate behind them, carrying a faint trace of the desert, a reminder that the world outside these walls had not stopped simply because they had stepped away from it. One of the men shifted his weight, boots scraping lightly against the ground, the sound sharp in the quiet. "That is not how this works," he said, more to himself than to Ethan. Ethan looked at him then, not with challenge, not with anger, but with a kind of clarity that had not been there before. "It is now," he answered. The words settled into the space between them, not loud, not forceful, but impossible to ignore. The man beside him exhaled slowly, running a hand along the back of his neck as if trying to ease a tension he could not quite name. "They will ask questions," he said. Ethan nodded once. "I know. And you will not have the answers they want." Ethan's gaze did not waver. "I know that too." The silence returned, heavier this time, filled with everything that could not be said without breaking something that had already begun to crack. The sun dipped lower beyond the walls, the light fading from gold to something softer, something that did not hold as tightly to the edges of things. Ethan reached into his pocket again, his fingers brushing against the turquoise stone, and for a moment he simply held it there, unseen, its presence grounding him in a way nothing else in this place could. He did not take it out. He did not need to. It was enough to know it was there. What happens now? One of the men asked quietly, the question slipping out before he could stop it. Ethan turned his head slightly, looking toward the open gate, toward the line where the desert began again, endless and indifferent. He did not answer right away. When he did, his voice was steady, but softer than before. Now we wait, he said. Not for orders. Not for permission. Just, for what would come. The men exchanged glances, uncertain, unsettled, as if the ground beneath them had shifted just enough to make standing still feel unfamiliar. Ethan did not move. He stood where he was, the outpost around him, the desert beyond it, and somewhere between the two, a line that no longer held the meaning it once had. And in that space, quiet and unresolved, something had begun that none of them could stop. The night did not fall all at once, it settled slowly over the outpost, like a blanket pulled across tired shoulders, dimming the edges of everything until only shapes and quiet movements remained, and Ethan Calloway stood near the far side of the yard where the light from a single lantern barely reached, his figure half lost in shadow as if the darkness itself had chosen not to fully claim him. The voices around him had softened, no longer sharp with questioning, but low, uncertain, carried in fragments that drifted and disappeared before forming anything whole. Men moved through their routines, checking gear, securing gates, doing what they had always done when the sun went down, but there was something different in the way they did it now, something slower, as if each action had to pass through a thought it never needed before. Ethan leaned back slightly against one of the wooden posts, the rough surface pressing through his coat, grounding him in a place that no longer felt entirely his. He reached into his pocket again, his fingers finding the smooth edge of the turquoise stone, tracing its shape without pulling it free, as if its presence alone was enough to hold something steady inside him. The air had cooled, carrying with it the faint scent of dry grass and distant earth, and for a moment, if he closed his eyes, he could almost imagine he was still out there, still standing under open sky where decisions did not echo the way they did here. Footsteps approached, slow and deliberate, and Ethan did not need to turn to know who it was. The man from earlier stopped a few feet away, close enough to speak without raising his voice, far enough to keep a line between them that neither seemed ready to cross. They sent word, he said quietly. Ethan opened his eyes but did not move from where he stood. Already? He asked. The man nodded once, though Ethan could hear it more than see it. Someone saw the riders turn back, he replied. That kind of thing does not go unnoticed. Ethan let out a small breath, not surprised, not unsettled, just acknowledging the inevitability of it. What did you tell them? He asked. There was a pause, longer than the question should have required, and in that pause, Ethan heard something shift, something careful being chosen. That you found nothing, the man said finally. Ethan turned his head slightly then, just enough to look at him through the dim light, his expression unreadable but not closed. And they believe that? He asked. The man shook his head faintly. They did not ask if I believed it, he said. They asked if I would stand by it. Ethan studied him for a moment, seeing now the weight behind the words, the quiet line that had been drawn not in the desert, but here, within these walls. And will you? Ethan asked. The man exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting past Ethan toward the open gate, where the darkness beyond seemed deeper than the night itself. I do not know, he admitted. But I know what I saw today. The wind moved again, slipping through the yard, brushing past them both, carrying with it the faintest trace of something that did not belong to this place. Ethan straightened from the post, the movement small but deliberate, as if shifting from thought into action without needing to announce it. That is enough, he said. The man looked at him, searching for something more, some explanation, some reassurance that would place everything back where it had been before. He did not find it. They will come, he said quietly. Not tonight. But soon. Ethan nodded once, the motion steady, accepting. I know. The words did not carry fear. They did not carry defiance. They simply existed, like a fact that did not need to be argued. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The lantern flickered slightly, the flame bending and straightening as the air moved around it, casting shifting shadows that made the space feel smaller, tighter, as if the walls themselves were listening. Then Ethan stepped away from the post and moved toward the edge of the yard, his boots quiet against the ground, his path leading not toward the center where the others gathered, but toward the open gate where the desert began again. He stopped just short of crossing it, looking out into the darkness where the land stretched wide and unbroken, where a single path could vanish without leaving a trace. His hand slipped from his pocket at last, the turquoise stone resting against his palm, catching what little light remained. He did not lift it. He did not study it. He simply held it there, as if acknowledging something that had already been decided. Behind him, the outpost remained still, waiting. In front of him, the desert offered nothing, and somehow, that felt more honest than anything he had left behind. The night stretched deeper beyond the gate, not empty but wide, the kind of darkness that did not close in but opened outward, and Ethan stood at its edge with the turquoise stone resting quietly in his hand, its surface catching the faint lantern glow behind him before fading again into shadow. He did not step forward. Not yet. The outpost breathed behind him, slow and uncertain, as if every man inside felt the shift but did not know how to name it. A board creaked somewhere. A boot scraped. Then silence again. The kind that listens. Ethan rolled the stone between his fingers, feeling the smoothness worn by time, by hands that had carried it long before his, and for a moment he wondered how many choices it had already witnessed, how many lines it had seen crossed without a sound. He closed his hand around it and lifted his gaze to the horizon, though there was nothing to see but darkness layered over distance. Somewhere out there, beyond what the eye could follow, Ayana was still. Moving. Not fast. Not careless. Just forward. He understood that now. Forward was not a direction. It was a decision. Behind him, footsteps approached again, firmer this time, more than one, and Ethan did not turn. He did not need to. He could hear the difference in the weight of them, in the way they stopped a few feet back, not uncertain, but resolved in a way the others had not been. A voice followed, older, steady, carrying authority that did not need to raise itself to be heard. "You should not be standing out here alone," the man said. Ethan let the words settle before answering. "I am not alone," he replied quietly. The statement hung in the air, not explained, not defended, just present. The man behind him paused, perhaps expecting more, perhaps realizing there would not be. "They will arrive by morning," he continued. "Orders will be clear when they do." Ethan nodded slightly, though the man could not see it clearly from behind. "Orders are always clear," he said. "It is the meaning that changes." The wind pressed through the open gate again, stronger now, carrying with it a faint chill that spoke of the night settling fully into place. The lantern behind them flickered, its light stretching thin across the ground before pulling back again, leaving more shadow than before. The man took a step closer, boots firm against the packed dirt, and Ethan could feel the shift in presence without turning to face it. "You are a good soldier," the man said, not as praise, not as comfort, but as fact. Ethan's expression did not change, but something in his shoulders eased, just slightly. "I was," he answered. The difference in tense did not go unnoticed. Silence followed again, heavier this time, as if the words themselves had drawn a line no one had expected to see. The man exhaled slowly. "There is still time to correct this," he said. Ethan looked down at the stone in his hand once more, then out toward the darkness beyond the gate, where nothing waited and everything did. "No," he said. "There is only time to understand it." The wind moved again, lifting the edge of his coat, brushing against his face like a reminder that the world did not pause for certainty. Somewhere behind them, a horse shifted in its stall, the soft thud of hooves against wood breaking the stillness for just a moment before it settled again. The man behind Ethan did not speak after that. He stood there, watching, perhaps hoping for a different answer, perhaps already knowing it would not come. Ethan remained where he was, the threshold beneath his boots marking a place between what had been and what would follow, and slowly, without hurry, he slipped the turquoise stone back into his pocket, deeper than before, as if placing it somewhere it could not be taken away. Then, at last, he stepped forward, crossing the line not with force, not with defiance, but with a quiet certainty that needed neither, and the darkness received him without resistance. The darkness did not close around him as he stepped beyond the gate, it widened, stretching out in every direction until the outpost behind him felt smaller with each passing second, its lantern light fading into something distant and uncertain. Ethan Calloway walked without rushing, his boots pressing into the cool desert ground, each step quiet but deliberate, as if the land itself understood that noise no longer had a place in what he was doing. The wind moved steadily now, no longer hesitant, brushing against his coat and carrying with it the faint trace of the path Ayanna had taken, not something visible, not something he could follow with his eyes, but something he could feel in the way the air shifted, in the way the silence held. He did not look back. Not once. The outpost had already become something behind him, something fixed in place while he moved forward into something that could not be undone. The horizon remained dark, but there was a difference now, a subtle change in the way the sky met the earth, a hint of gray beginning to form far in the distance where night would eventually give way to morning. Time was moving, whether anyone inside those walls was ready for it or not. Ethan reached into his pocket as he walked, his fingers finding the turquoise stone again, its surface cooler now under the night air, but still steady, still real. He turned it once in his hand, then held it there. Not for comfort, not for reassurance, but as a reminder that something small could carry the weight of a choice long after the moment had passed. The ground shifted slightly beneath his boots as he moved over uneven terrain, small rocks and dry brush marking the path, and he adjusted his steps without breaking rhythm, his body remembering how to move through open land without thought. After a while, the outpost was gone from sight completely, swallowed by distance and darkness, and with it went the last trace of the life he had known before this night. He did not stop. He did not hesitate. He continued forward until the land began to rise slightly beneath him, forming a low ridge that stretched across the desert like a quiet boundary. He climbed it without effort, his breath steady, his movements controlled, and when he reached the top, he paused for the first time since leaving the gate. From there, the land opened again, wider, deeper, and in the faint early light that now touched the edge of the horizon, he saw something. Not clearly. Not sharply. But enough. A figure in the distance, moving slowly, steady, unbroken. Ayanna. She had not stopped. She had not turned back. She had kept walking, just as she said she would. Ethan stood there for a long moment, watching, not calling out, not moving toward her, just seeing. The distance between them remained, measured not in yards but in choices already made, in paths already taken. He could follow. He could close that distance. But he did not move. Not yet. Instead, he reached into his pocket one last time and took out the turquoise stone, holding it up slightly as the first light of dawn touched its surface, the color catching and reflecting in a way that made it seem almost alive against the pale sky. He looked at it, then at the figure ahead, and something in his expression settled, not into certainty, not into peace, but into understanding. The wind passed over the ridge, stronger now, carrying the first breath of a new day, and Ethan closed his fingers around the stone again before lowering his hand. Then, without hesitation, he stepped forward, not toward the outpost, not back toward what he had left, but in the same direction she had taken, his pace steady, his path no longer uncertain, and the desert opened before him without resistance, as if it had been waiting all along. The distance between them closed slowly, not because either of them rushed, but because both had chosen the same direction, and in the quiet language of the open land, that was enough. Ethan Calloway walked with a steady rhythm, his steps measured against the rising light, the cool edge of dawn brushing across his face as the desert shifted from shadow into shape. Ahead, Ayanna did not turn immediately, but something in the way she moved changed, a subtle pause, a slight slowing, as if she had felt the difference in the air before she saw it. When she finally stopped and turned, the distance between them was no longer endless, no longer defined by uncertainty, but by something that had already been decided without words. She watched him approach, her posture steady, her expression unreadable, but not closed. Just, aware. Ethan slowed as he drew closer, not out of hesitation, but out of respect for the space that still existed between them, the space that did not need to be erased to be understood. The light grew stronger, stretching across the land, revealing the lines of exhaustion in her stance, the weight she had carried through the night, and the quiet strength that had carried her farther than most would have gone. He stopped a few feet away, close enough to see her clearly, far enough to leave the choice of distance untouched. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The wind moved between them, softer now, carrying the first warmth of the day, and in that stillness, everything that had passed found its place without needing to be named. "You came," Ayanna said at last, her voice low, steady, not surprised, not questioning, just acknowledging. Ethan nodded once. "I said I would stand," he replied. "I did not say where." The faintest shift touched her expression, not quite a smile, not quite relief, but something that lived somewhere between the two. She studied him for a moment longer, as if measuring the truth of what stood before her against everything she had known before. "And now?" she asked. The question carried more than direction. It carried weight. Ethan glanced briefly at the horizon, the land stretching wide and open in every direction, then back at her. "Now I keep walking," he said. "The same as you." The words did not ask permission. They did not demand acceptance. They simply offered something real. Ayanna held his gaze, searching for something beneath the surface, something that could not be spoken, and whatever she found there, it was enough. She turned then, not away from him, but forward again, toward the path that lay ahead, and after a brief pause, she stepped forward once more. Ethan followed, not behind her, not ahead, but beside her, their pace matching without effort, their direction shared without discussion. The land unfolded before them, ridges and valleys shaped by time rather than design, and the sun rose higher, casting long shadows that stretched behind them, not in front. They did not speak again for a while. There was no need. The silence between them was no longer uncertain. It was understood. After some time, Ayanna reached up and touched the space at her neck where the turquoise stone had once rested, her fingers pausing there as if acknowledging something that was no longer hers to carry. Ethan noticed, but he did not reach for the stone in his pocket. He did not need to. Its weight had already shifted into something else, something that did not belong to one person alone. The wind moved across the land again, stronger now, carrying the sound of distant life, the faint rustle of movement beyond what the eye could see, and somewhere within it, the past loosened its hold just enough to let the present stand on its own. They walked on, two figures against the wide expanse, their shadows trailing behind them, their path unmarked but certain, and in the quiet rhythm of their steps, something had been restored, not through force, not through victory, but through the simple act of choosing to move forward together. Years later, the desert still remembered the shape of their footsteps even after the wind had long erased them, and the land where they once walked together had become something more than just a stretch of earth between two horizons. The sun rose the same way it always had, slow and steady, casting light across ridges and valleys that had seen men come and go without leaving anything behind, but this time, something remained, not in the ground, not in the dust, but in the way the silence carried a different weight. Ayanna stood at the edge of a high ridge, her figure still and composed, her gaze fixed on the distant outline of a place she had not visited in many seasons. The outpost. Smaller now. Weathered. The wood faded under years of sun and wind, the structure holding together not by strength, but by habit. Around her, a line of riders waited, their presence quiet, respectful, not pressing forward, not asking questions. They had followed her here without needing to know why. That was enough. The wind moved through her hair, carrying with it the faint scent of dry earth and something older, something that did not belong to any one place or any one time. She reached into the fold of her garment and drew out the turquoise stone, its surface unchanged, its color still catching the light the same way it had on that morning when everything shifted. For a moment, she held it in her palm, her fingers tracing its edges, remembering without needing to close her eyes. Then she stepped forward. The riders behind her did not follow. They remained where they were, watching, understanding that this part did not belong to them. Ayana descended the ridge alone, her steps measured, steady, the distance between her and the outpost closing slowly, not with urgency, but with purpose. As she approached, figures began to appear within the yard, men older now, movement slower, but their attention sharp, drawn to the sight of a single rider walking toward them without hesitation. No one reached for anything. No one called out. They simply watched. She stopped just outside the gate, the same threshold where a man had once stood between two worlds, and for a moment, everything seemed to fold back into that single point in time. The wind passed through, quiet, familiar. Ayana stepped forward and crossed the line. The ground beneath her feet did not change, but the meaning of it did. The men stood still, their eyes following her as she moved through the yard, her presence carrying something they could not name but could not ignore. She reached the center, the place where questions had once been asked, where silence had once answered them, and she stopped. Slowly, without a word, she lowered her hand and placed the turquoise stone on the ground. It made no sound as it touched the dust, but the weight of it settled through the space like something far heavier. No explanation followed. None was needed. The wind moved again, lifting the edge of coats, brushing against faces that had seen years pass but had not forgotten that single day. One man shifted his stance. Then another. No one spoke. And then, without command, without signal, they lowered their heads. Not in surrender. Not in fear. In recognition. Ayana did not look back. She did not wait. She turned and walked away the same way she had arrived, her step steady, her path already chosen. Behind her, the outpost remained, but something within it had changed, something quiet and lasting that would not be undone by time or by men who believed they could draw lines and decide what stood on either side. The stone remained where she had placed it, small, unremarkable to anyone who did not understand, but to those who had seen, it held everything that needed to be remembered. And in the silence that followed, long after she disappeared beyond the ridge, no one moved to pick it up. Because out here, justice did not need to speak. It only needed someone willing to carry it, and someone else brave enough to return it.